Who are our greatest presidents? What lessons can the modern-day business leader learn from our 46 chiefs of state? Find out in this podcast series with Tom Fox and Richard Lummis to delve into the great and not-so-great presidents to mine their successes and failures for today's business executive.
In the past, we've done podcasts discussing numerous presidents of the United States, including many of the lesser-known ones. Researching the careers of these men has given us a number of surprises, and I've come away impressed by some of the people I thought were pretty much non-entities. Another surprise to us is that we have not yet covered George Washington, probably because he's so well known we simply overlooked him. However, despite having read several biographies about him, looking at his career from a leadership perspective has given me a new appreciation for our first president. His career was lengthy and varied, so we've split it into 4 podcasts. The first dealing with his experience as a young man during the conflict I grew up calling the French and Indian War. The second will deal with his role as general of the armies during the American Revolution. Third, with his role in the Constitutional Congress and the Continental Congress. And the fourth with his presidency. George was born in 1732, the eldest son of Augustine Washington's second marriage, although he had 2 half-brothers from a prior marriage. The family was relatively prosperous until his father died when he was 11, and he never had more than the equivalent of elementary school in the way of formal education. At 16, he joined a team of surveyors working in the Shenandoah Valley region, which was then still part of the Wilderness West. When he was 18, his half-brother Lawrence, 14 years his senior, contracted tuberculosis. George accompanied him to Barbados for the climate, which seems an odd choice to me, but Lawrence died. It was the only time George left what is now the United States. On his return, he lobbied for Lawrence's old post commanding the local militia, and despite having absolutely no military training, he was awarded it. The French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, was a global conflict primarily between France and Great Britain. In North America, the British basically controlled the Atlantic seaboard, but the French and their Indian allies controlled the inland waterways, including the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. Of more importance to the British, by 1753, they were infiltrating the Ohio River Valley into what's now Pennsylvania, building forts. Virginia Governor Robert Dinwiddie asked Washington to lead a diplomatic expedition to warn the French to abandon their forts. He undertook a 500-mile trek through the wilderness, which was a failure, because although the French commander at the fort received him cordially, he declined to abandon the fort. On his return, Washington published a journal of his travels, which gave him a considerable amount of celebrity, and he was promoted to second in command of the Virginia Regiment. Dinwiddie sent him back to complete a fort located at the forks of the Ohio in present-day Pittsburgh. On the way there, they found out the French had already captured the fort. Washington received word from one of his Indian allies, an Iroquois named Tanagrisson, that the French were coming to attack him. What happened next on May 28th is disputed, but what is clear is that the French commander, Ensign Joseph Coulon de Villiers de Jumonville, was killed. According to the French, he was delivering a peaceful diplomatic summons to the British. Tom, this incident and the subsequent incident at Fort Necessity, which I guess I should cover now. Sorry, backtrack. Washington retreated to an area called the Great Meadows and built Fort Necessity, which was badly sited due to surrounding hills. That's an odd mistake for a surveyor. On July 3rd, it was attacked by 600 French soldiers with 100 Indian allies commanded by Captain Villiers, Jumonville's older brother. After suffering severe casualties, Washington accepted the French terms for surrender. Unfortunately, the document of surrender actually stated the French were acting to avenge the assassination of Jumonville. This ignorance of French, pouring rain, darkness, and an incompetent translator all contributed to the debacle. But basically, this started the 7 Years' War. Tom, what do you want to take from this about a 22-year-old Virginian starting a world war?
So this was one of the really interesting things that I frankly was not aware of. The the massacre at what's now called Jumonville Glen. Jumonville, of course, was, as you correctly noted, the French commander. But if I could perhaps take a step back, when I proposed this series to you, I thought we would garner leadership lessons really throughout Washington's career. And what I found in researching for this podcast about his early years in the French and Indian War were not really leadership lessons, but perhaps some character values or personality traits that we see fully more developed later. The one thing that struck me about the early years of Washington was his ambition. As you noted, also, he lobbied successfully to take over the Virginia militia from the Governor Dinwiddie with really no experience other than being a surveyor. And, throughout this podcast series, we've obviously talked about many different forms of leadership. I'm not sure we've ever focused on ambition as a key component of every leader. And the thing that struck me is it's okay to have ambition. And it's okay to be ambitious. It's okay to lobby for yourself. And we saw George Washington do this, at least by the 1750s, perhaps even earlier in the 1740s. So that was sort of the first thing that struck me here. And also, I had thought his role in the French and Indian War was really around his surrender, and then, of course, the massacre that we'll get to a little bit later. But no, it really was this Jumonville Glen. I guess you would just have to call it a skirmish. I think 15 Frenchmen died as a result of the attack by Washington and his troops. And we're going to cite in our show notes to some of the resources we both researched for this. And it turns out that Washington may have actually fired the first shot. Literally the shot around the world, as this was the First World War. And I was really stunned to find that out. There was a massacre of Frenchmen at this juncture, in addition to the killing of Jumon, and that got blamed on Washington. I was not aware of that story. He blamed it on poor communications with his Indian allies. Other research we both read indicated that there was a lot going on, or may have been a lot going on, and the Indians really struck their own road for their own reasons in their killing of French soldiers who were wounded and then scalping the French soldiers they had killed. Nevertheless, it became a very large sore point between the French and the British, really, which I was not aware of. His role in Fort Necessity, where he surrendered the fort, poorly planned, constructed fort, but to a much larger French force, and that may have been as pivotal a reason as any, humiliated Washington. And back at that time, I guess even today, perhaps, the surrender of a military unit is viewed as extraordinarily negative. Yet Washington, I think, learned from that, and we'll talk about that in his generalship. That led to the Braddock's attempt to retake Fort Necessity, Braddock's defeat, and the massacre, where Braddock was surrounded by a superior force of Indians. Braddock was killed, and 2/3 of his men were killed. Washington displayed great courage, and I don't think that can be underestimated at this site. He is noted to have had several bullet holes through his clothes. I think his saddle was shot as well, and this really helped restore his reputation. None of the reading or research I did indicated he did this consciously, as some other officers did, most particularly in the Civil War. But the great courage he displayed in this tragic engagement really helped, I think, restore his reputation as well. What were some of your thoughts around these issues?
Well, I totally agree about his role in Braddock's campaign. One of the things that struck me is a recurring theme in his leadership is he was often extremely aggressive. And, his attack on the French, I think, is an early example of that. I think you're right. From our reading, it was fairly clear there was a lot going on in the Ohio River Valley whose context Washington did not understand at the time. The surrender was, I thought, just a fascinating example because the descriptions of it, it's nighttime, you're surrounded by wounded and dead people screaming. It's pouring rain. The document is given to you. You've got an elementary school education. You don't speak French. The ink is running in the rain, and the translator says, "Oh yeah, this is great. Let's sign this." It was not his finest hour, I don't think. But I do think you're right that his personal courage in Braddock's campaign, and Braddock had personally selected him as an aide to go with him on the campaign. So there was something about him that still inspired confidence even after the Fort Necessity disaster.
So one of the things, or I guess a couple of things that we see a little bit later, I wondered and wanted to explore with you, were they precursors to what we saw? And when I thought through the surrender, we saw in the Revolutionary War, not Washington surrendering, obviously, but strategic retreats. And he's one of the few really, truly great military commanders who is acknowledged to have lost more battles than he won, because he won the important one. But he had losses. He retreated. He knew when to retreat. Sometimes he made strategic retreats. Sometimes he retreated because he was outmaneuvered or he didn't want to be outmaneuvered. But he knew, and I often wondered if the experience of the surrender really informed his decision-making abilities later in his military career. That was sort of part one. Part two was early on in his career, he seemed to have, I don't want to say uncontrol of his emotions, but he seemed to be much more emotional than the Washington that I grew up with as the first president of our country. And he seemed to learn to control his emotions at some point, either in this period of the French and Indian War, but certainly by the Continental Congress. He seemed to be someone who, if not stiff, was perhaps charitably called aloof. And I wondered if these experiences, the death of his brother certainly impacted him greatly as well, but we see these sort of play out a little bit later. You mentioned his trip to Barbados. I'm going to talk about that in terms of the Revolutionary War. That was an event I was not aware of, and it turned out it had some fairly significant impacts during the Revolutionary War as well. So I guess, Richard, from this exploration of his early life and the French and Indian War phase of his career, I saw the beginnings of what we were later able to identify as many of the great leadership traits of Washington. And the most specific I saw, in addition to what I just articulated, was great personal courage leading from the front. And particularly in the massacre, where Braddock went down, he didn't die immediately, but command had to pass, and Washington was able to extract the survivors of that massacre back to the English lines.
In retrospect, I guess one of the reasons he may have been so good at the strategic retreat is he started practicing early. And it was his poise and his command in the extraction of the survivors that I think also made his reputation in the Braddock event. The other thing that some of the historians we've looked at said that it did was confirm his belief in his own, if not invincibility, his selection by Providence or God for great things.
Could we call that ambition today?
Well, yes, but I think it goes beyond that. I think having the two horses shot out from under you and all the holes in your coat might make you think that you were lucky. And that, of course, was one of Napoleon's characteristics for selection of generals.
Richard, I look forward to continuing this conversation.
I do as well. So next up is going to be his career during the Revolutionary War, which, again, I was familiar with the broad outlines, but I think we found out some interesting things, and we hope you'll listen. For now, there's Richard Lummis and Tom Fox.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you for listening to this episode of Presidential Leadership. If you enjoyed this podcast, I hope that you will write us a review on iTunes, as it would help get the word out about this new podcast series focusing on leadership lessons from American presidents for the business professional today. This podcast is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network.